The Watcher Part 1. The First to See. The hospice closed on a Friday, not the gentle kind of closing where there are meetings and discussions in a timeline that lets people prepare. The kind where at 3:45 on a cold March afternoon in 2024, the regional director walks into the staff room of the Millbrook Hospice Program in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont and tells 8 nurses that the parent organization has decided the program is no longer financially sustainable. 2 weeks of severance, a printed list of grief counseling resources, and a form letter explaining that the 14 patients currently on active census would be transferred to the Burlington program, which would now be expected to drive 2 hours each way to make home visits in the kingdom, which everyone in that room understood meant those patients would not actually be visited at the rate they needed. Marin Gallagher was 24 years old. She had worked at Millbrook for 2 years. She was wearing the same blue scrubs she had worn that morning when she sat for 3 hours beside a dying farmer named Joseph Kittredge in his own bed while his wife rested in the next room. Joseph had wanted to talk about the dairy herd he had sold 5 years earlier. He had named every cow. He remembered which ones had been difficult births and which ones had come easy. He remembered a black and white Holstein named Pepper, who used to wait by the gate every morning, and lo, when she saw him coming across the pasture. Marin had sat and listened and had not checked her phone once. That was the work she had come to hospice to do, the work that drew on her clinical training and on something deeper, something her grandmother Bridget had taught her without ever naming it directly. The capacity to sit with a person in their last weeks and be fully present, not managing, not fixing, just bearing witness. Now standing in the staff room with the other 7 nurses, Marin understood that the work was over. She drove home in her 10-year-old Honda Civic. The drive from the hospice office on Millbrook's Main Street to her studio apartment above the hardware store took 4 minutes. She parked in the alley behind the building. She climbed the exterior wooden stairs to the 2nd floor. She unlocked the door. She set her keys on the small table beside the door. She sat on the edge of her bed. The apartment was $610 a month. It had a narrow galley kitchen, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub in a single room that served as bedroom, living room, and dining room. The landlord had painted the walls pale yellow before Marin moved in. There was one window that looked east toward the Green Mountains. Marin sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. On the table beside the door next to her keys was the leather satchel her grandmother Bridget had given her. A small, soft bag of worn brown leather with a brass clasp and a single inside pocket. The satchel was 60 years old. Bridget had carried it on her midwifery rounds across the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts for 47 years. She had pressed it into Marin's hands 3 days before she died in October of the previous year at the age of 89. Marin had carried the satchel to every hospice visit for the 7 months since. She had not put tinctures in it. She had not used it as a working bag. She had simply carried it slung across her body on top of her clinical nursing bag as a kind of quiet daily reminder that the work she was doing was work her grandmother would have understood. Now she picked up the satchel and held it on her knees. The brass clasp was smooth under her thumb. She opened her laptop. She checked her bank account. $1,840. The severance check would add another $1,180 after taxes. $3,020 total. Rent was $610. Groceries were maybe $300 a month if she was careful. Health insurance through the state exchange was $270. She could last 3 months if she found nothing. The job market for hospice nurses in the Northeast Kingdom was essentially zero. The nearest functioning program was the Burlington one that had just absorbed the Millbrook patients. Marin could not in good conscience apply there. She could move back to the Berkshires. Her mother Colette still lived in the small, white-frame house in the mill town where Marin had grown up. Colette had retired from her hospital nursing job the previous autumn after 31 years. She would welcome Marin home. But sitting on the edge of her bed with the brass clasp of her grandmother's satchel under her thumb, Marin decided she was not going to move back. She had spent 2 years building a relationship with this landscape, with the dirt roads that disappeared into the Green Mountain foothills, with the elderly farmers who had known her by her first name within 3 months of her arrival, with the particular quality of light that came through the maples in October and the way the snow fell in January in absolute silence. She was not going to walk away. She did not know yet what she was going to walk toward, but she knew she was staying. On Saturday morning, Marin made coffee in the French press on her kitchen counter. She sat at the small table under the east window. She opened her laptop. And instead of searching for nursing jobs, she did something she could not entirely explain. She opened the Colonia County government website and navigated to the surplus property page. For 2 years, driving the back roads of the kingdom on her hospice rounds, Marin had developed a habit of noticing buildings, not the houses people lived in, the other ones, the shuttered creameries at the edge of abandoned dairy farms, the empty one-room schoolhouses with their bell towers still intact, the small commercial buildings on village main streets that had once been general stores, or feed and grain offices, or country apothecaries, and now stood empty with their windows boarded and their original hand-painted signs bleaching white in 50 Vermont winters. She had noticed them the way some people notice birds. She did not know why she was looking at surplus property listings now. She only knew that when she thought about what came next, the image that rose in her mind was not another job in another hospital. It was the ghostly outline of one of those old buildings, waiting. The Colonia County surplus property page listed 6 properties. 4 were vacant lots. 1 was a collapsed barn, and 1 was a building in the village of Walden Center, 14 miles northwest of Millbrook. Single structure, 1,400 square feet on 2 stories. Built in 1882 by a Swiss-German immigrant pharmacist named Johann Fischer. Operated continuously as a country apothecary under 3 generations of the Fischer family until 1968. Used briefly as a Boy Scout troop hall from 1971 to 1989. Empty since the county took possession in 2002 for unpaid back taxes. Asking price $1. There was a single photograph. A narrow 2-story commercial building. White painted clapboard weathered to a soft pearl color. Steep metal roof. Bracketed front porch. A tall bay window with 18 panes of old wavy glass. And above the door, a hand-painted wooden sign bleached almost white, but still carrying the ghost of letters, J. Fischer Apothecary, established 1882. Marin looked at the photograph for a long time. She could feel something shifting in her chest, a small clean movement like a drawer opening. She stood up. She put on her coat. She got in her car. The drive from Millbrook to Walden Center took 38 minutes. The road wound northwest through low hills covered in bare maples and white pine. Marin passed 3 dairy farms, one of them still operating, 2 abandoned. She passed a cemetery with headstones dating to the 1790s. She passed a sugar house with a rusted metal roof and last year's firewood stacked under a tarp. Walden Center was the kind of Vermont village that consisted of a white clapboard Universalist church, a one-room post office, a closed general store, a working dairy farm at the south end of the green, and 7 white frame houses arranged around a triangular common with a Civil War monument at the center. The apothecary stood on a side street called Mill Lane, 2 blocks east of the green. Marin parked on the street. She turned off the engine. She sat in the car for 3 minutes without moving. Then she got out. She walked slowly to the front of the building. The white clapboard siding had weathered to the color of old bone. The bracketed overhang above the small front porch was intact. The tall bay window beside the door was unbroken. Every one of the 18 original wavy glass panes still in its frame, dusty but uncracked. Above the door, the hand-painted wooden sign still showed the ghost of its original lettering. The word apothecary was almost gone, but the name Fischer and the date 1882 were still faintly visible if you knew to look. Marin stood on the sidewalk for 47 minutes. She did not go inside. She did not try the door. She just stood and looked. At one point, an elderly man walking a small brown dog stopped and asked if she needed help. Marin said no thank you, she was fine. The man looked at the building, then back at Marin and nodded as if he understood something. He walked on. When Marin finally got back in her car, her hands were shaking slightly. She did not know why. She drove back to Millbrook as the sun dropped toward the western hills. She ate a bowl of soup standing at her kitchen counter. She went to bed early. She did not sleep well. On Monday morning, she drove to the Colonia County Clerk's office in St. Johnsbury, 22 miles southeast of Millbrook. The clerk's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building that had once been the town hall. Marin climbed the stairs. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. A woman in her early 60s sat behind a wide oak counter that looked like it had been there since the building was constructed. The woman looked up. Marin said, "I'm here about a property listing, the old Apothecary in Walden Center." The woman's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. She said, "Name, Marin Gallagher." The woman stood. She was small and compact with short gray hair and a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors. She wore a cardigan over a white blouse and a silver cross on a chain. She said, "Iris LeClaire. I've been the county clerk here for 26 years." She pulled a file from a cabinet behind the counter. She opened it on the oak surface between them. She looked at Marin for a long moment. Then she said, "You're a hospice nurse." It was not a question. Marin said, "I was. The Millbrook program closed 2 weeks ago." Iris nodded slowly. "I know. My sister-in-law was on your census. Edith LeClaire, the dairy farmer's widow on the Cabot Plains Road." Marin remembered a small white-haired woman of 86 who drank her coffee black and wanted to die in her own bed. Marin had sat with her 4 times in the last 2 weeks of February. Iris said, "Edith spoke about you. She told my husband the night before she died that you reminded her of her own grandmother. Her grandmother was a midwife in the eastern townships back in the 20s. Edith did not say that lightly." Marin did not know what to say. She nodded. Iris looked down at the file, then back at Marin. She said, "The Walden Center Apothecary. In 26 years, 3 people have come into this office to ask about that building. 2 of them wanted to tear it down for the lot. 1 wanted to turn it into a vacation rental. I sent all 3 of them away." Marin said, "Why?" Iris tapped the file with 1 finger. "Because the county will sell it to you, Miss Gallagher, for $1. She opened a drawer in the counter. She took out a small brass key on a faded green ribbon. She said, "This key belonged to Thomas Fischer. He was the last apothecary. He gave it to the county clerk in 1968 when he closed the shop. The clerk in 1968 was my own father. Thomas and my father were friends from the Universalist Church. Thomas told my father when he handed over this key that the next person to use it should be someone who understood that the apothecary was not just a building." Iris held the key between her thumb and forefinger. The ribbon was frayed at the edges. The key was old iron, dark with age. She said, "I have kept this key in a drawer of this desk for 26 years, Miss Gallagher. I am very glad it is going to you." Iris stamped the deed with a heavy metal stamp that made a sound like a small bell. She slid the paper across the counter. She placed the brass key on top of it. Marin signed the deed. She picked up the key. The ribbon was soft against her fingers. The key was heavier than she expected. She said, "Thank you." Iris said, "Go see it today." Marin drove from St. Johnsbury back to Walden Center that same afternoon. The sun was already low when she pulled onto Mill Lane. The light came through the bare maples at a hard slant, throwing long shadows across the street. She parked. She walked to the small front porch. She stood for a moment with the brass key in her hand. Then she put the key into the lock of the heavy front door and turned it. The lock turned with a small, clean click, as if the key had been used yesterday instead of 56 years ago. The door swung inward. Marin stepped into Johann Fischer's apothecary for the first time. The interior was breathtaking. A single long room ran the full length of the ground floor, perhaps 15 feet wide and 40 feet deep. Wide pine plank floor scuffed to a silver gray. Tin press ceiling painted ivory oxidized now to a soft buttermilk color, beginning in 2 places near the back to bow gently downward. Pale sage green beadboard walls faded to the color of dried sweetgrass. The light coming through the tall bay window was golden and thick with dust. Along the right-hand wall ran a long oak counter, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. And behind it, taking up the entire left-hand wall from floor to ceiling, 15 feet long and 8 feet tall, stood the tincture cabinet. It was the most extraordinary piece of furniture Marin had ever seen in person. Hand-built of quarter-sawn white oak, finished with a dark amber shellac that had darkened across 9 decades to the color of old molasses. The cabinet was divided into 108 small drawers arranged in a 12 by 9 grid. Each drawer fronted with a small brass pull and a small ivory tag inscribed with a Latin botanical name in faded copperplate script. Marin walked the length of the counter slowly. She read the tags one at a time. Achelea millefolium, Arnica montana, Atropa belladonna, Digitalis purpurea, Hydrastis canadensis, Matricaria chamomilla, Valeriana officinalis, Withania somnifera, and 100 others. Above the drawers, running the full length of the cabinet at eye level, was a single horizontal display shelf. 28 small glass tincture bottles stood on it, each one stoppered with a cork, each one half full of dark amber or deep green or rich russet liquid that had clearly been sitting on that shelf since the day Thomas Fischer locked the front door behind him in 1968 and walked away. Marin stood in front of the tincture cabinet for a long time. Her hands were trembling slightly. She had grown up in her grandmother Bridget's kitchen, watching Bridget prepare simple tinctures in clean glass jars with vodka and cheesecloth. She had filled 3 composition notebooks with her grandmother's instructions, carefully copied in the copperplate script Bridget had learned as a girl in a one-room schoolhouse in the Berkshire Hills. She had spent 2 years of hospice work carrying her grandmother's empty tincture satchel across her body without ever putting a single working tincture inside it. And now she had walked into a room that held 108 Latin-labeled botanical drawers and 28 bottled tinctures her grandmother could have recognized blindfolded. Marin walked to the center of the cabinet. She put her hand on a small drawer labeled Achillea millefolium, yarrow, her grandmother's first plant. The first one Bridget had taught her to identify when Marin was 4 years old, and they had been walking together along the river that ran through the center of the mill town in western Massachusetts where Marin had grown up. She pulled the drawer open. Inside was a small, papery handful of dried yarrow flowers, 55 years old, their pale white-yellow petals gone almost beige, but their characteristic flat clustered shape still perfectly recognizable, their dry chamomile and camphor scent rising thinly out of the drawer in the still air of the apothecary. Marin closed the drawer. Her eyes were wet. She did not let the tears fall. Because her grandmother Bridget had taught her when Marin was 11 years old that a person who works with dried plant material does not cry on the materia medica. The salt, Bridget had said, accelerates the breakdown of the active alkaloids. Bridget had said it with a small, dry humor in her voice that had made Marin laugh at the time. Marin was not laughing now, but she understood the rule. She walked the cabinet again, opening drawers as she went, finding a small, papery handful of the corresponding dried herb in each one. Calendula, comfrey, lobelia, black cohosh, white willow bark, chamomile, valerian. All the herbs Bridget had taught her in the Berkshire foothills, present here 90 years after Johann Fischer had first stocked the cabinet. She reached the back of the cabinet, the last column of drawers on the right side. She opened the bottom right corner drawer labeled Withania somnifera, ashwagandha. The drawer was unusually shallow. Marin frowned. The other drawers in the cabinet had been about 6 inches deep. This one was about 3 inches deep. She closed the drawer. She studied the back of the cabinet from the side, peering through the narrow gap between the cabinet and the back wall. The cabinet's back panel below the bottom right drawer did not match the back panel above it. Above the bottom drawer, the back was a single broad oak panel. Below the bottom drawer, invisible unless you noticed the depth discrepancy, the back was a separate, smaller panel. A false back, a concealed compartment built into the bottom right corner of the cabinet, sized to fit behind the artificially shortened Withania somnifera drawer. Marin crouched down in front of the cabinet. She reached behind the bottom row of drawers and felt along the false back panel with her fingertips. In the lower right corner, you found a small wooden peg set at an angle, acting as a friction latch. She pushed the peg sideways. The false back panel swung open on a tiny iron hinge. Behind the panel was a shallow rectangular space, about 10 inches wide, 6 inches tall, 4 inches deep. Inside the space, laid carefully on a folded square of unbleached cotton cloth that had yellowed to the color of old parchment, were 3 objects. A small, thick book bound in worn brown leather, hand-stitched, a soft suede pouch, drawstring closed, the suede gone smooth with age and weight, and a folded letter on heavy cream paper, sealed with a small disc of brown wax that had been pressed with a thumbprint. Marin carried the 3 objects to the long oak counter. She set them on the worn surface in the late afternoon sun coming through the tall bay window. She sat down on a wooden stool she dragged in from the corner. She opened the leather book first. It was a handwritten materia medica, a working pharmacist's reference book, but not the kind a person could buy at any university pharmacy school. It was an entirely original document, written in a careful slanted hand combining English-Latin and what Marin would later learn was Swiss-German Mun dialect. The book was approximately 400 pages long. The first page, dated April 14th, 1883, bore the inscription in the same careful hand J. Fischer, his book of plant medicines for the hill country of the Upper Connecticut. The book was an original American adaptation of Old World Swiss-German plant pharmacology to the specific botany of the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. Johann Fischer had begun it in 1883. His son Henry had continued it until 1958, and Henry's son Thomas had written the final entries from 1958 to 1968, 85 years of empirical pharmacology, by 3 generations of one Swiss-German immigrant family, adapting old-world herbal craft to a specific Vermont landscape and to the specific colds and pregnancies and arthritis flare-ups of 3 generations of Walden Center dairy farmers and their families. Marin set the book down very carefully. Her hands were trembling more now. She opened the suede pouch next. Inside were gold coins. She counted them slowly. 42 American gold coins from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Liberty quarter eagles and half eagles, and a few full eagles. The dates ranging from 1881 to 1932. The coins in remarkable condition for their age. Marin knew nothing about numismatics. She would learn later from a coin dealer in Burlington that the gold weight alone was worth approximately $34,000 at current market prices, and that the collector premium, because of the condition and the date range, brought the total value to just over $52,000. But sitting on the wooden stool in the late afternoon light, Marin only understood that she was looking at a significant amount of money, hidden in a drawer for 56 years. She set the pouch down beside the leather book. She opened the wax-sealed letter last. The wax disc cracked away in 2 clean pieces. The paper inside was heavy. The handwriting was the same careful slanted hand as the final entries in the Materia Medica. Marin read it slowly. To the next person to open this drawer. My name is Thomas Fischer. I am the 3rd-generation apothecary of this shop, which my grandfather Johann opened in April of 1882. I am writing this letter on the evening of October 19th, 1968. I am 61 years old. Tomorrow morning, I will lock the door of this shop for the last time and walk away. I am not retiring because I want to. I am retiring because the world has decided in the last 15 years that the trade of the country apothecary is no longer needed. The penicillin and antibiotics that came after the war have made most of our infusions and decoctions seem old-fashioned. The CVS pharmacy that opened in St. Johnsbury in 1962 has taken most of the simple prescription work that kept this shop solvent. My own son is studying engineering at the University of Vermont, which is the right choice for him. I am leaving the Materia Medica in this hidden compartment behind the bottom right drawer because I cannot bring myself to donate it to the medical school library at Burlington, where it will be cataloged as a historical document and shelved in closed stacks and forgotten. The book is not a historical document. The book is a working tool. The book contains 85 years of empirical observation about how specific Vermont plants behave in specific Vermont weather in specific Vermont human bodies. None of that observation can be replicated. None of it can be looked up in a textbook. It exists only in this book, in the careful copperplate script of 3 generations of my family. If the book sits in an archive, it dies. If the book sits in this drawer for 100 years and is then found by someone who can use it, the book lives. The gold is what my grandfather and my father and I set aside across 85 years as a private fund. We did not deposit in any bank. My grandfather did not trust banks after 1893. My father did not trust them after 1933. I have not trusted them because my father did not. The gold is yours. Use it however you choose. I do not know who you are. I am writing to a stranger across a distance of years I cannot calculate. I am trusting only that the person who eventually opens this drawer is a person who will understand when she reads the Materia Medica what 85 years of careful patient observation looks like. A village apothecary is in the end a person who watches. A person who watches what the plants do and what the weather does and what the bodies of her neighbors do, and who writes down what she sees in a careful book. The trade is not glamorous. It has not been profitable since the late 1950s, but it is, I believe, a trade that some small portion of the rural world will always need, because antibiotics do not address every condition, and because there are some forms of suffering that the prescription pad does not reach. If you are reading this, you are the person I have been writing to without knowing it for 85 years and 4 months and 3 days. Welcome to the Apothecary. Thomas Fischer, October 19th, 1968. Marin read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the hidden compartment beside the materia medica and the suede pouch of gold coins. She sat very still on the wooden stool in the late afternoon sun. She did not cry. Bridget had taught her when she was 11 that a person who works with dried plant material does not cry on the materia medica. The rule extended, Marin understood now, to letters from former apothecaries too. She said aloud to the empty apothecary and to the 108 Latin-labeled drawers and to the 28 tincture bottles on the display shelf above them. "Thank you, Mr. Fischer." Her voice was steady. She said, "I am the watcher." Outside, the sun dropped below the ridgeline of the western hills. The light in the apothecary shifted from gold to amber to a soft blue twilight. Marin sat on the wooden stool for a long time. She thought about her grandmother Bridget, who had taken her into the woods almost every weekend from the time Marin was 4 years old, teaching her to identify yarrow by the lacy white flat-topped clusters of its summer flowers, calendula by the orange-gold petals that closed at sundown, comfrey by the rough-haired leaves that left a faint green stain on the fingers. By 12, Marin could prepare a simple tincture in a clean glass jar with a kitchen vodka and cheesecloth. By 15, she had filled 3 composition notebooks with her grandmother's instructions in Bridget's careful copperplate script. Her mother, Colette, had not approved. Colette had become a hospital nurse precisely because she had decided that her mother's herbalism was a half-trade that did not deserve a place in modern medicine. She had not forbidden Marin from learning what Bridget taught, but she had made it clear across many quiet kitchen table conversations during Marin's high school years that she expected her daughter to choose a clinical, credentialed career and leave the herb work behind. Marin had compromised. She had enrolled in the nursing program at the University of Vermont, earned her RN, done a year of acute care work at Burlington Medical Center that she had hated every minute of. Because the pace of the floor had not given her time for the attentive bedside work she had grown up watching her mother do. She had transferred at 22 to the rural hospice program in Millbrook. Hospice work had been the right fit, work that asked her to sit with a dying farmer in his own bed for 3 hours while his wife rested in the next room, work that drew on her clinical training and her grandmother's quiet education in equal measure. She had been at Millbrook Hospice for 2 years when the parent organization announced on a cold Friday afternoon in early March that the program was being closed. And now, sitting on a wooden stool in an empty apothecary in a village she had never heard of 3 days ago, Marin understood that the last 2 years had not been random. The work at Millbrook had taught her how to sit with people in their final months, how to listen, how to be present without trying to fix what could not be fixed. And her grandmother Bridget had taught her years before that how to recognize yarrow in a field, and how to prepare a simple tincture, and how to write careful observations in a composition notebook. And Thomas Fischer, who had locked this door 56 years ago and walked away, had left behind a book and a letter in a hidden drawer, because he understood that some trades are not about making money or earning credentials. Some trades are about watching and writing down what you see and waiting for the next person who will understand what that means. Marin stood up from the stool. She walked to the tall bay window. She looked out at Mill Lane. The street was empty. The light was almost gone. She thought about the $1,840 in her bank account. She thought about the $610 rent on her studio apartment in Millbrook. She thought about the fact that she had just bought a 1,400 square foot building with no heat and failing plaster walls and a tin press ceiling that was beginning to bow. She thought about the fact that she had no plan, and then she thought about Thomas Fischer's letter. If you are reading this, you are the person I have been writing to without knowing it for 85 years and 4 months and 3 days. Marin put her hand flat against the cold glass of the bay window. She said quietly, "I don't know what I'm doing, Mr. Fischer, but I'm staying." She locked the door behind her when she left. She drove back to Millbrook in full dark. She climbed the stairs to her studio apartment. She made a cup of tea. She sat at the small table under the east window. And for the first time in 2 weeks, she felt something that was not grief or fear or uncertainty. She felt the small, clean movement of a drawer opening, the beginning of something she could not yet name, but that she recognized the way her grandmother Bridget had taught her to recognize yarrow in a field by its shape and its scent and the way it grew. Part 2, Learning to See. Marin kept the studio apartment in Millbrook for the first 6 months. $610 a month, paid on the first. She could not afford to give it up until she knew the apothecary in Walden Center had running water that worked, and a roof that did not leak, and walls that would hold through a Vermont winter. Every morning she woke at 6, made coffee in the French press, ate oatmeal standing at the counter, and by 7 she was in her Honda Civic driving the 38 minutes northwest to Walden Center, with her grandmother's leather satchel on the passenger seat and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. The first week she did nothing but look. She walked the building slowly, upstairs and down, taking notes in a composition notebook. The second floor had been storage. 3 rooms with sloped ceilings under the steep metal roof. Dusty, full of empty wooden crates and old filing cabinets and a few pieces of furniture covered in sheets. But structurally sound. The roof above was tight. No water stains on the ceiling. No rot in the floorboards. Downstairs was the apothecary itself, the long room with the tincture cabinet, and behind it, through a narrow door, a small back room that had once been Johann Fischer's compounding area. A wooden workbench along one wall, shelves above it, a small cast-iron sink with a pump handle. Marin worked the handle. After a minute of resistance, water came. Rust-colored at first, then clear and cold. The building had no heat except for a wood stove in the main room. Cast iron. Ornate. Made in 1891 according to the plate on the door. The chimney was intact. Marin would need to have it swept before she could use it. But it was there. The electricity worked. Marin flipped switches. Lights came on. Bare bulbs and ceramic fixtures. The wiring was old but functional. What did not work were the walls. The interior plaster walls had been failing along the back wall and the south wall for decades. In places, the horsehair plaster had begun to crumble into soft, pale heaps along the baseboards. When Marin pressed her palm against the south wall near the back corner, she could feel it flex slightly, like pressing on a bruise. The walls needed to be stripped and replastered with traditional lime mortar. Marin did not know how to strip and replaster horsehair plaster. She spent 3 days in the University of Vermont Library in Burlington reading every book on traditional Vermont plaster restoration she could find. She took notes, she made sketches. She learned that horsehair plaster was a mix of lime sandwater and animal hair used as a binder. That it had been the standard wall treatment in American buildings from the late 1700s through the early 1900s. That when it failed, you could not simply patch it with modern joint compound. You had to strip it back to the lath and replaster with a lime-based mortar, mixed in the traditional proportions, or the new plaster would not bond. On the 4th day, Marin asked the reference librarian if there was anyone in the area who still did traditional plasterwork. The librarian thought for a moment, then she said, "Emil Kruger. He's in his late 60s now, retired mostly, but he taught the restoration program at the technical college for 20 years. If anyone knows lime plaster, it's Emil." Marin found Emil Kruger's number in the phone book. She called. A man answered on the 3rd ring. Marin explained who she was and what she needed. Emil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The old Fischer place in Walden." "Yes, sir. I know that building. My father bought his stomach powders there in the 50s, when Thomas Fischer was still running it. Thought you should know that before you hire me." "I'm not sure I can hire you," Marin said. "I don't have much money, but I need to learn how to do this work myself. I was hoping you might be willing to teach me." Another pause. Then Emil said, "Come see me Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. Bring work clothes." Emil Kruger lived in a small farmhouse on the outskirts of St. Johnsbury. When Marin arrived on Saturday, he was standing in the driveway beside a white pickup truck. Tall, lean, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and a canvas jacket that looked older than Marin. He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he nodded toward the truck. "Get in, we'll go look at your walls." They drove to Walden Center. Emil walked through the apothecary slowly. He put his hands on the failing plaster. He tapped it with his knuckles. He pulled a small pocket knife from his jacket and used it to scrape away a section near the baseboard to expose the lath beneath. He studied the lath. He studied the plaster that had fallen. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the ceiling for a full minute without speaking. Then he turned to Marin and said, "This is a 6-weekend job if I teach you right. 2 hours of instruction each Saturday. Then you work on your own during the week. I'll come back the following Saturday to check your work and teach you the next step. You'll make mistakes. That's fine. Lime plaster is forgiving if you stay patient. How much? Marin said. $400. Marin did the math in her head. She could do 400, barely. She said, okay. Emil shook his head. I mean 400 total, for all 6 weekends. That's what I charge when I'm teaching someone who's going to do the labor themselves. That's not enough. It's the right price, Emil said, and the way he said it made clear the conversation was over. They started the following Saturday in May. Emil taught her how to strip the failing plaster back to the lath without damaging the wooden strips beneath, how to mix lime mortar in the correct proportions, 3 parts sand to 1 part lime putty, how to apply the scratch coat, the brown coat, the finish coat, how to work in sections, how to keep the plaster damp while it cured so it would not crack. He taught her slowly. He did not rush. When Marin made a mistake, he showed her how to fix it without making her feel foolish. By August, Marin had stripped and replastered the entire back wall and the entire south wall herself. Emil sat in a folding chair on the front porch during her final session, calling out corrections when she needed them. When she finished the last section, he came inside and ran his hand over the wall. He nodded once. That'll hold, he said. The walls held through the first winter. They held through the second. While the plaster was curing in June, Marin began working on the Materia Medica. She had been reading it in the evenings, sitting at the long oak counter with the leather-bound book open in front of her and a desk lamp she had brought from her apartment angled to throw light across the pages. The early entries were in English. Johann Fischer's English in 1883 was formal and careful. The handwriting was beautiful. Each letter formed with the same attention to detail that had gone into building the tincture cabinet. April 14, 1883. I have today received a shipment of arnica montana from a supplier in New York. The quality is poor. The flowers are brown and smell of mold. I will not use them. In Grindelwald, my teacher Frau Heidi taught me that arnica must be harvested in full sun and dried in shade within 6 hours, or it loses potency. I do not know if Vermont arnica follows the same rule, but I will learn. June 3, 1883. Today I gathered wild Achillea millefolium from the pasture behind the Dunbar dairy farm. The plant here grows taller than in Switzerland. The flower clusters are larger. I prepared a tincture using the same method Frau Heidi taught me. 1 part dried flower to 5 parts of alcohol. I will wait 6 weeks and then test the potency against the Swiss Achillea I brought with me. August 12, 1883. The Vermont Achillea tincture is ready. I tested it this morning on a small cut on my own hand. The tincture stops bleeding as effectively as the Swiss variety, but the scent is different, sharper, more camphor. I believe this is because the Vermont summer is hotter than the Alpine summer. Heat brings out different compounds in the same plant. Marin read entry after entry, Johann learning the Vermont landscape 1 plant at a time, testing, observing, writing down what he saw. In 1920, the handwriting changed. Henry Fischer's hand was less formal than his father's, but just as careful. March 7, 1920. My father died yesterday. He was 70 years old. He worked in this shop until the day before he fell ill. I found a note in his desk this morning. It said, only keep the book going, so I will. Henry's entries were more clinical, more focused on dosage and preparation method, but the same patient observation ran through every page. In 1958, the handwriting changed again. Thomas Fischer's hand was slanted and compact, efficient. April 2, 1958. My father died last week. I have been going through his notes. There are 47 entries in this book that are written partially or entirely in Mun dialect. The Swiss German my grandfather spoke, I can read some of it, but not all. My father translated many of these entries into English over the years, but not the ones he considered most important. He told me once that if I did not speak Mund, I was not truly a Fischer. I think he was joking, but I am not certain. Marin stopped reading. She went back through the book slowly, counting. Thomas was right. 47 entries, scattered throughout the 85 years, written entirely in a dense Germanic script that Marin could not read. She felt something tighten in her chest. These were not random entries. They were the entries Johann had considered too important to write in English. The knowledge he had brought from the Alps, the techniques Frau Heidi had taught him, the observations that could not be easily explained or replicated, and they were locked away in a language Marin did not speak. She sat at the oak counter for a long time that evening, the book open in front of her, the sun going down outside the tall bay window. She could hire a translator. There were probably people at the University of Vermont who spoke Swiss German. She could scan the pages, send them off, get back a translation. But that would cost money she did not have. The $400 for a meal, the materials for replastering, the basic costs of keeping the building maintained. The gold coins were still in the suede pouch in the hidden compartment. Marin had not touched them. She was living on what remained of her severance and her savings. She had maybe $3,000 left. A professional translation of 47 pages of technical dialect would cost at least that much. And something else stopped her. The thought of sending these pages to a stranger felt wrong, like a violation of the care Thomas Fischer had taken to hide them. Marin closed the book. She said aloud to the empty apothecary, "I'm going to have to learn Swiss German." The next morning, she drove to the UVM library in Burlington. She found the linguistics section. There were 3 books on Swiss German. 2 were academic grammars. One was a conversational guide titled Schweizerdeutsch for Anfänger, Swiss German for beginners. Marin checked out all 3. She spent the next 6 months teaching herself Swiss German. Every evening after her work on the building was done, she sat at the oak counter with the Materia Medica on her left and the grammar books on her right. She made vocabulary lists. She worked through the pronunciation guides. She watched YouTube videos of Swiss people speaking Berndeutsch, the Bernese dialect that was closest to the Moon dialect Johann Fischer had spoken. It was slow. It was frustrating. Swiss German was not like the German Marin had taken 2 semesters of in college. The syntax was different. The vocabulary was different. Whole grammatical structures existed in Swiss German that did not exist in High German. But Marin kept going. By September, she could read simple sentences. By November, she could work through a paragraph with the help of a dictionary. By February of the following year, she had translated her first full entry. It was an entry from Johann dated June 18, 1891, about symphytum officinale, comfrey. In the village of Grindelwald, the old woman Heidi taught me that being well heals broken bones, but only when harvested on the night of the full moon in June. I laughed at her. I thought this was superstition. When I came to Vermont, I tested this. I harvested comfrey on the full moon night of June 1889, and I harvested comfrey on a night with no moon in July 1889. I prepared tinctures from both. I gave the June tincture to a farmer named Dunbar, who had broken his arm falling from a hay wagon. I gave the July tincture to a farmer named Kittredge, who had broken his wrist working a plow. The Dunbar arm healed in 4 weeks. The Kittredge wrist healed in 7 weeks. I do not know why the full moon matters, but Frau Heidi was correct. Marin read the entry 3 times. She sat very still. This was not superstition. This was not folklore. This was 85 years of empirical observation that modern science had not yet caught up to. Johann Fischer had tested the full moon harvest against the new moon harvest. He had observed the results. He had written down what he saw, and he had concluded that something about the full moon in June made comfrey more effective for bone healing. Marin did not know if it was the lunar cycle affecting the plant's chemistry, or the longer daylight hours in June, or some combination of factors Johann could not have known to measure. But she knew that Johann had been right, because he had watched, and he had written it down. And now, 133 years later, Marin was reading his observations and understanding that the formulas in this book were not just recipes. They were the record of when and where and how. The record of a man who had spent his entire life learning to see. In March of the 2nd year, a man came to the apothecary. Marin was working on the 2nd floor cleaning out the storage rooms to prepare for converting them into a small apartment. She heard the knock on the front door. She came downstairs. A man stood on the front porch. Late 60s, tall, thin, wearing a barn coat and work boots. He said, "Are you the one who bought this place?" "Yes," Marin said. "Marin Gallagher." The man nodded. "Gareth Winters. I've farmed down the road. Dairy. Or I did until I retired 5 years ago." He paused. "I heard you were a hospice nurse." "I was. I need to talk to you about something. Can I come in?" Marin stepped aside. Gareth walked into the apothecary. He looked at the tincture cabinet for a long moment. Then he turned back to Marin. He said, I have pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 3 months ago. The oncologist in Burlington wants me to do the chemotherapy, says it might give me another 6 to 12 months. Marin said carefully, I'm sorry. I'm not doing the chemo, Gareth said. I watched it kill my wife 5 years ago. Watched her spend her last 6 months too sick to eat, too weak to get out of bed, vomiting every day. I'm not doing that. Marin nodded. She understood. Gareth said, I heard you were opening this place back up, doing what the Fischers used to do. I need to know if that's true. Marin said, I can't cure cancer. No herb can do that. You need to understand that clearly. I know, Gareth said. I'm not asking you to cure me. I'm asking if you can help me not hurt so much. Help me sleep, help me eat. So the time I have left is time I can actually use. Marin looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas Fischer's letter. There are some forms of suffering that the prescription pad does not reach. She said, I can try, but I need you to understand what I am and what I'm not. I'm not a doctor. I'm not licensed. I can't prescribe medication. What I can offer you is plant medicine, tinctures and teas that might help with nausea and pain and sleep. That's all. That's what I'm asking for, Gareth said. Marin drove to Gareth's farmhouse 3 times a week for the next 3 months. She brought tinctures. She prepared herself using the methods in the Materia Medica. Ginger and turmeric for nausea. An infusion Henry Fischer had developed in 1943, combining both in equal parts with a small amount of black pepper to increase absorption. Valerian for sleep, but not the standard preparation. Thomas Fischer's entry from August 1964 noted that valerian harvested in late August after rain was twice as effective as valerian harvested in dry weather. Marin waited for rain. She harvested. She prepared the tincture exactly as Thomas had described. For the pain in Gareth's lower back where the tumor was pressing on his spine, Marin used comfrey. Not taken internally, but as a warm compress. The preparation Johann had learned from Frau Heidi. Harvested on the full moon in June, dried in shade, mixed with warm water to create a paste. Applied to clean cloth. Laid across the lower back for 30 minutes. Gareth did not do chemotherapy, but he ate. He slept 6 hours a night. He sat on his front porch in the afternoons and played checkers with his granddaughter. He was present. He was himself. In June, he died. Marin was there, sitting in a chair beside his bed, his granddaughter Nora on the other side. Gareth's breathing slowed and then stopped. Quiet, easy, like falling asleep. Nora cried. Marin sat with her. After a while, Nora said, Thank you. You gave him something the hospital couldn't. You gave him 3 months where he was still grandpa, not just a sick person. Marin drove back to Walden Center that evening. She sat on the front porch of the Apothecary as the sun went down. She thought about Gareth, about the Materia Medica, about Thomas Fischer's letter. A village apothecary is a person who watches. Marin was learning to watch. By the fall of the second year, Marin had refilled more than half of the 108 drawers in the tincture cabinet. She harvested yarrow from the dairy farm pastures along the Millbrook Road in July, when the flowers were fully open. She grew calendula in a small kitchen garden she started behind the apothecary. She gathered comfrey from the riverbank on the full moon in June, exactly as Johann had instructed. She replaced the 28 bottles on the display shelf one by one with fresh tinctures she prepared herself. Using Bridget's kitchen methods for the simple preparations. Using the more advanced methods she read in the Materia Medica for the complex ones. She built a climate-controlled display case from reclaimed Vermont oak and installed it on the wall opposite the tincture cabinet. Inside, she placed the Materia Medica open to a different page each week. In September, the St. Johnsbury Universalist Church called. The pastor, a woman named Reverend Michaela Ross, asked if Marin would be interested in part-time work as a pastoral care visitor. 20 hours a week, visiting elderly church members who could no longer attend services, sitting with them, listening, providing companionship. $24 an hour. Marin said yes. The work was exactly what she had done at Millbrook Hospice, driving to 12 homes a week, bringing her grandmother's leather satchel, bringing small jars of yarrow and chamomile tea from herbs she had gathered herself, bringing the attentive bedside time the Burlington Hospice could no longer afford to provide. It was enough money to live on. Barely, but enough. The apothecary became slowly what Johann Fischer had originally built it to be. A place where people came to ask quiet questions about plant medicine, where Marin answered what she could and referred what she could not, where the Latin-labeled drawers and the bottled tinctures were slowly across the seasons working materials again. Not a museum, not a historical recreation, a working apothecary. In November, Marin had a dream. She was standing in the apothecary, but it was not the apothecary as it existed now. It was the apothecary as it had been in 1883. The walls were freshly painted. The tincture cabinet was new. The wood gleamed. Johann Fischer stood behind the oak counter, a tall man with a dark beard and careful hands. He was preparing a tincture, measuring dried herbs from one of the small drawers, pouring alcohol from a brown glass bottle. He looked up at Marin. He said in accented English, "You are doing good work." Marin said, "I'm trying." Johann smiled. "That is all the work requires. Trying, watching, writing down what you see." He paused. "My son Henry will continue this, and his son Thomas. And now you. The book does not end. It only changes hands." Marin woke in her small apartment on the second floor of the apothecary. It was still dark. She lay in bed for a long time, thinking about the dream, about Johann's words. The book does not end. It only changes hands. She got up. She went downstairs. She opened the climate-controlled case and took out the Materia Medica. She carried it to the oak counter. She opened it to the last page Thomas Fischer had written. October 18th, 1968. This is my final entry. Tomorrow I will lock the door. I do not know who will open it next, but I trust that whoever she is, she will understand what this book means. Not as history, but as instruction. Watch the plants, watch the weather, watch the bodies of your neighbors. Write down what you see. That is the work. Below Thomas's entry, the rest of the page was blank. Marin sat looking at that blank space for a long time. Then she took a pen from the drawer beneath the counter. She thought about what she had learned in the 2 years since she had opened the hidden compartment, about lime plaster and Swiss German and comfrey harvested under the full moon, about Gareth Winters and the 3 months he had been given to be himself instead of just a diagnosis. She thought about her grandmother Bridget, who had taught her to watch, who had given her the leather satchel, who had never told her directly that the watching was the trade itself. Marin put pen to paper. She wrote in careful script, practicing the copperplate hand she had been teaching herself by copying the Materia Medica entries. Continuation by Marin Gallagher, November 1st. December 1st, 2025. Vermont yarrow harvested late October after first frost. Dried petals hold camphor scent stronger than summer harvest. Johann was right in his entry of August 12th, 1883. Heat changes the compounds, but so does cold. Cold brings out the medicine in ways warmth does not. She set down the pen. She read what she had written. It was not elegant, it was not profound, but it was true. It was observation. It was the beginning of her own contribution to the 85 years that had come before. She closed the book gently. She placed it back in the climate-controlled case. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, small, dry flakes that caught the light from the street lamp on Mill Lane. Marin stood at the tall bay window and watched the snow come down. She thought about Thomas Fischer locking this door in 1968, walking away, believing the trade was probably ending forever. And she thought about herself, standing here 57 years later, the tincture cabinet half full again. The Materia Medica open to a page she had just written. The apothecary breathing. The trade had not ended. It had only waited. For someone who would recognize a hidden drawer when she stood in front of it. Someone who would understand what 85 years of careful patient observation looked like. Someone who had been taught without knowing she was being taught how to watch. Marin touched her palm to the cold glass of the window. She said quietly, "I'm still learning, Mr. Fischer, but I'm watching." The snow fell, the night deepened, and in the apothecary behind her, 108 small drawers waited in their 12 by 9 grid. Half of them filled now with fresh, dried herbs, the other half still empty, still waiting, but not for much longer. Part 3, Teaching to See. Colette came in July. Marin had not seen her mother in 3 years. Not since the week after Marin bought the apothecary, when Colette had called from the Berkshires and asked if Marin was coming home. And Marin had said no, she was staying in Vermont. And Colette had gone quiet on the phone for a long time before saying, I see it in the careful, clinical voice she used when she was hurt, but did not want to show it. They had written letters since then, real letters, on paper. Colette's letters had been short at first, updates about the house, about neighbors, about the weather. But in the months since Colette had retired from the hospital, the letters had grown longer, more reflective. Colette wrote about cleaning out the attic and finding boxes of Bridget's things, old midwifery records, dried herbs wrapped in newspaper from the 1970s, a leather bag that had carried Bridget's supplies before she started using the satchel she eventually gave to Marin. Colette wrote, "I have been thinking about my mother more since she died, about the work she did, about why I spent so many years telling myself it did not matter." Marin had written back carefully, not pushing, just listening on paper the way she had learned to listen at hospice bedsides. And now in July, Colette called and said, "I would like to come see what you have been doing, if that would be all right." Colette arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a silver Toyota that Marin had never seen before. Marin was working in the small garden behind the Apothecary harvesting calendula. She heard the car pull up on Mill Lane. She stood. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She walked around to the front of the building. Colette was standing beside the car, looking up at the hand-painted sign above the door. J. Fischer Apothecary, established 1882. The letters were still faint, still bleached almost white, but visible if you knew to look. Colette was 61 years old. She had worked as a hospital nurse for 31 years. She had raised Marin alone after Marin's father died when Marin was 3. She was a small woman with gray hair cut short and careful hands and a way of standing very still that Marin had inherited. She turned when she heard Marin's footsteps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Colette said, "Hello, Marin." "Hi, Mom." They stood looking at each other. 3 years folded into the space between them. Then Colette smiled slightly and said, "Are you going to show me?" Marin led her mother inside. Colette stepped through the door and stopped. She stood in the center of the long room. She did not speak. She turned slowly, taking it in. The wide pine plank floor, the tin-pressed ceiling, the pale sage walls, the long oak counter, and the tincture cabinet rising along the left wall like a piece of cathedral architecture built to hold not prayers but plants. Colette walked to the cabinet. She moved along it slowly, reading the Latin tags on the 108 drawers, her lips moving slightly as she read, Achillea millefolium, Arnica montana, Calendula officinalis, Matricaria chamomilla. She stopped at the drawer labeled Achillea millefolium, yarrow. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she reached out and pulled the drawer open. Inside was fresh, dried yarrow, harvested by Marin in late October after the first frost. The pale yellow-white petals still holding their flat, clustered shape. The scent rising out of the drawer, chamomile and camphor, and something sharper that the cold had brought out. Colette lifted a small pinch of the dried flowers between her fingers. She held it to her nose. She closed her eyes. She stood that way for almost 3 minutes. When she opened her eyes, they were wet. She said in the careful clinical voice she had used for 31 years of hospital nursing, "Your grandmother knew where to find every one of these plants in the Berkshires." Marin said quietly, "Yes, she did." Colette set the yarrow back in the drawer carefully. She closed it. She turned to look at Marin. She said, "I was wrong about her." Marin did not say anything. Colette said, "I spent 31 years believing that what my mother did was not real medicine, that it was folk practice, tradition, something quaint that belonged to an earlier time but had no place in a modern hospital." She paused. "I have been thinking about that since she died, about why I needed so badly to believe it." "Why did you?" Marin asked. Colette looked back at the tincture cabinet. "Because if I admitted that what she did mattered, then I had to admit that I had walked away from it, that I had chosen something else, and that maybe my choice had not been as inevitable as I told myself it was." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother delivered 1,247 babies in 47 years. I found the records in the attic. She kept a log, every birth, the mother's name, the date, the time, whether it was an easy birth or a hard one, whether the baby came fast or slow. She wrote observations, small things. This mother bled more than expected. This baby's cord was wrapped twice. This labor stopped and started 3 times before the baby came." Colette turned back to Marin. "That is not folk practice. That is clinical documentation. That is a practitioner keeping records so she can learn from her own experience. Your grandmother was doing science. She just was not doing it in a hospital. Marin felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been held tight for a very long time. She said, "I didn't know she kept logs." "Neither did I," Colette said. "Not until I found them." She paused. "There is a box in my car. Letters your grandmother wrote to me over the years. I never answered most of them. I want you to have them." They carried the box inside together. Colette stayed 3 nights. She slept on the daybed in Marin's small second-floor apartment. During the day, she read the Materia Medica. Marin set up a chair for her at the oak counter with good light from the bay window. Colette read slowly, taking notes in a composition notebook she had brought with her, stopping occasionally to ask Marin a question. On the second day, Colette found the entry Marin had translated from Johann Fischer about comfrey in the full moon. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Marin. She said, "Do you believe this? I tested it," Marin said. "Last June, I harvested comfrey on the full moon and 3 days later on the waning moon. I prepared tinctures from both. I used them both as poultices on a man named Gareth Winters, who had bone pain from cancer pressing on his spine. The full moon preparation worked faster. I do not know why, but Johann was right." Colette looked back at the entry. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "When I was a student nurse, we were taught that traditional medicine was based on superstition, that the scientific method had replaced guesswork with evidence. But this is not guesswork. This is observation. It's testing, documentation. This is the scientific method applied by someone who did not have a laboratory but had time and patience and the discipline to write down what he saw." She closed the Materia Medica gently. She said, "I wish I had understood this when your grandmother was alive." On the evening of the second day, Marin and Colette sat on the front porch of the Apothecary as the sun went down. The dairy farm at the south end of the village green released its evening milking herd into the back pasture. The single chimney of the Universalist church across the green caught the last sun on its iron weather vane. Colette said, "Tell me about your grandmother, the things I would not listen to when she was alive." So Marin told her about learning to identify yarrow when she was 4 years old, about filling 3 composition notebooks with Bridget's instructions, about the rule that you do not cry on the Materia Medica because salt accelerates the breakdown of the active alkaloids, about the leather satchel Bridget had pressed into her hands 3 days before she died. Colette listened without interrupting. When Marin finished, Colette was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to tell you something about your grandmother that you do not know." Marin waited. Colette said, "In 1978, there was a blizzard. February, 3 feet of snow in 24 hours. The roads were impassable. Your grandmother had 3 women in labor that day. 3, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, 1 at night. She walked to all 3, 2 miles to the first house, 1.5 miles to the second, 3 miles to the third, in a blizzard, in 15-degree weather. She delivered all 3 babies safely. She walked home after the last one, got home at 4 in the morning, made herself tea, went to bed." Colette paused. "I was 14. I remember her coming home that night. I remember thinking she was crazy, that she should have told those women to get themselves to a hospital, that what she was doing was dangerous and irresponsible." Colette looked at Marin. "I was wrong. What she was doing was her job, the job she had agreed to do, and she did it without complaining, without asking for recognition. She just walked through a blizzard because 3 women needed her." Marin said, "I did not know that story." "I never asked her about it," Colette said. "I never asked her about any of it. I was too busy being ashamed of work I should have been proud of." On the morning Colette left, she stood beside her car in the driveway. The sun was just coming up. The air was cool and still. She said, "I was wrong about your grandmother. I have been thinking about that since she died. I am sorry it took me so long to say it." Marin stepped forward and hugged her mother. Colette held on tight. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. She said, "Keep going, keep watching, keep writing it down. That is the work she wanted you to do, and it is good work." She got in the car. She drove away. Marin stood in the driveway until the silver Toyota disappeared around the curve of Mill Lane. Then she went back inside the Apothecary. She opened the climate-controlled case. She took out the Materia Medica. She turned to the page where she had written her first entry. She read it, then she turned the page and wrote a second entry, July 15th, 2026. My mother came to see the apothecary today. She read this book for 3 days. She told me stories about my grandmother I had never heard. She said my grandmother was doing science, not folklore. Science. I believe she is right. Forgiveness. I am learning as a kind of slow tincture. You cannot force it. You can only wait. Alcohol and time and patience until the active compound finally pulls clean from the resistant plant material and the liquid in the jar turns the color it was always going to turn. Marin set down the pen. She closed the book. She placed it back in the case. Outside, the morning was brightening. The street was quiet. And inside the apothecary, 108 small drawers waited. More than half of them full now, the rest slowly being filled. In October, a girl came to the door. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Marin was upstairs in her apartment preparing tincture labels at the small desk she had set up by the window. She heard the knock. She came downstairs. A young woman stood on the front porch, 19 or 20, wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt and white sneakers, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had a canvas messenger bag slung across her body. She said, "Are you Marin Gallagher?" "Yes." "My name is Willa Hartwell. I saw the article about you in the St. Johnsbury paper, about the man you helped, Gareth Winters, about how he died at home instead of in a hospital." Marin remembered. A local reporter had come to interview her after Gareth's granddaughter Nora had written a letter to the editor thanking Marin publicly. The article had been short, respectful. It had described Marin as an herbalist who provided end-of-life care using traditional plant medicine. Marin had been uncomfortable with the attention, but Nora had asked her to do the interview, and Marin had agreed. Willa said, "I need to ask you something. Can I come in?" Marin stepped aside. Willa walked into the apothecary. She stopped just inside the door. She looked at the tincture cabinet for a long moment. Then she turned back to Marin. She said, "I was a first-year medical student at UVM. I dropped out 6 weeks into the semester." Marin waited. Willa said, "They were teaching us to fix people like they were machines, diagnose the problem, prescribe the solution, move on to the next patient. No one taught us how to listen. No one taught us how to sit with someone who was dying and just be present. No one taught us that sometimes the best thing you can do is not try to fix anything at all." She paused. "I could not do it. I tried, but I could not learn medicine that way, so I left." Willa looked around the apothecary again, at the cabinet, at the bottles on the display shelf, at the Materia Medica in its climate-controlled case. She said, "My parents are furious. They think I threw away my future. Maybe I did, I do not know, but I know I could not stay in that program." Marin said gently, "What are you asking me, Willa?" Willa met her eyes. "I am asking if you would teach me, not the way the medical school teaches, the other way, the way your grandmother taught you, going into the woods, learning the plants, learning how to sit with people, learning how to watch." Marin looked at this girl standing in the apothecary, 19 years old, wearing a gray sweatshirt and white sneakers, holding a canvas messenger bag like a student heading to class. And Marin saw herself 5 years ago, 19 years old in her first year of the nursing program at UVM Burlington, hating the pace of the acute care floor, hating the way the work did not give her time to sit with patients, hating the feeling that she was being trained to manage symptoms instead of care for people. She had been lucky. She had found hospice work. She had found a way to do the work that mattered to her. But what if she had not found it? What if she had dropped out instead? What if she had been standing where Willa was standing now, asking someone to teach her a different way? Marin said, "If I teach you, you will not make much money. You will have to work other jobs to support yourself. The work is slow. It is quiet. Most people will not understand what you are doing." "I know," Willa said. "And you will make mistakes. You will harvest the wrong plant. You will prepare a tincture incorrectly. You will sit with someone who is dying and not know what to say. That is part of learning." "I know," Willa said again. Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Can you be here Saturday morning, 8 o'clock? Wear boots and bring a notebook." Willa's face opened into a smile. "Yes, thank you. Yes." On Saturday morning, Willa arrived at 7:50. She was wearing hiking boots and jeans and a canvas jacket. She carried a leather-bound notebook and a pen. Marin met her at the door. She had her grandmother's leather satchel slung across her body. She said, "We are going to walk. There is a field behind the apothecary where yarrow grows wild. That is where we will start." They walked through the small garden Marin had planted, past the calendula and the chamomile and the comfrey growing along the fence line. They walked through a gap in the fence and into the open pasture beyond. The field was full of late-season wildflowers, goldenrod and asters and Queen Anne's lace, and in the far corner near the tree line, a patch of yarrow still holding a few late blooms. Marin led Willa to the yarrow patch. She knelt down in the grass. Willa knelt beside her. Marin said, "This is the first plant my grandmother taught me when I was 4 years old. It is the first plant I am going to teach you." She touched the yarrow gently, the flat-topped white flower clusters, the lacy fern-like leaves. She said, "Acalia millefolium, common yarrow. It grows all over the northern United States, in fields and along roadsides and in places where the soil has been disturbed. Some people call it a weed, but it has been used as medicine for thousands of years." Willa leaned closer, looking at the plant carefully. Marin said yarrow stops bleeding. It brings down fever. It helps with colds and flu. My grandmother used it for all of those things. But the important thing is not just what the plant does. The important thing is learning to see it, to recognize it in a field full of other plants, to know when to harvest it, how to dry it, how to prepare it. She picked a single flower cluster. She held it out to Willa. "Smell it." Willa took the flower. She brought it to her nose. "Chamomile," she said, "and something sharper." "Camphor," Marin said. "Marmethon." That sharp scent is camphor. It gets stronger when the plant is dried, and it gets even stronger when the plant is harvested after the first frost. The cold brings out compounds that the heat does not. Willa wrote in her notebook. Marin said, "That is the watching. That is what my grandmother taught me. Not just the name of the plant, not just what it does, but when to harvest it, what conditions make it stronger, what the plant is doing in response to its environment." She paused. A village apothecary is not someone who knows a lot of plant names. A village apothecary is someone who watches what the plants do, who writes down what she sees, who learns over years and decades how a specific plant in a specific place responds to specific conditions. Willa looked up from her notebook. "That is what you are teaching me, to watch." "Yes," Marin said, "that is what I am teaching you. That is what I am." They stayed in the field for 2 hours. Marin showed Willa how to identify yarrow by its leaves as well as its flowers, how to tell the difference between yarrow and similar-looking plants like Queen Anne's lace, how to harvest the aerial parts without damaging the roots so the plant would come back next year. When they walked back to the apothecary, Willa's notebook had 4 pages of careful notes. Her hands smelled like yarrow. She was smiling. Marin said, "Next Saturday, same time, bring the same notebook. We will go to the river and I will show you comfrey." Willa said, "I will be here." That evening, Marin sat on the front porch of the apothecary as the sun went down. The dairy farm at the south end of the green released its evening herd into the back pasture. The iron weather vane on the Universalist church caught the last light. Inside the apothecary behind her, the 108 Latin-labeled oak drawers stood in their 12 by 9 grid. More than half of them refilled now, and the 28 tincture bottles on the upper display shelf had been replaced one by one with 28 new bottles of fresh tincture Marin had prepared herself across 3 years of patient work. Marin thought about her grandmother Bridget, who had taken her into the woods almost every weekend from the time Marin was 4 years old, teaching her to identify yarrow by the lacy white flat-topped clusters of its summer flowers. She thought about Johann Fischer, who had immigrated from a Swiss village in 1881 and had opened a small apothecary in Walden Center in April of 1882, and had begun the following spring to write the first careful empirical entries in a hand-stitched leather book that would still be in service 141 years later. She thought about Thomas Fischer, who had locked the door of the apothecary in October of 1968 and had walked away knowing that the trade he had inherited was probably ending forever, and who had nevertheless taken the trouble that night to write a letter to a stranger he could not name, sealed with a thumbprint of brown wax. sized to fit behind a deliberately shortened drawer in the bottom right corner of his grandfather's tincture cabinet. And she thought about her mother, Colette, who had driven up from the Berkshires in July and had stood in front of the Achillea millefolium drawer and had said in careful clinical English that she had been wrong. Marin had forgiven Colette. Forgiveness, she had come to understand, was a kind of slow tincture. Alcohol and time and patient waiting until the active compound finally pulled clean from the resistant plant material and the liquid in the jar turned the color. It was always going to turn. And this afternoon, she had stood in a field behind the apothecary with a 19-year-old girl who had dropped out of medical school. And she had knelt down beside a patch of yarrow. And she had said, "This is the first plant my grandmother taught me when I was 4 years old. It is the first plant I am going to teach you." The circle was closing, not ending, just closing and opening again in the same motion. Marin stood up from the porch steps. She went inside the apothecary. She walked to the climate-controlled case. She opened it. She took out the materia medica. She carried it to the oak counter. She opened it to the page where she had written her last entry about her mother's visit. She turned the page. She picked up the pen. She wrote in the careful copperplate script she had been practicing for 3 years. October 12th, 2026. Today I taught my first student. Her name is Willa Hartwell. She is 19 years old. She left medical school because they were teaching her to fix people like machines. She asked me to teach her the other way, the way my grandmother taught me. We went to the field behind the apothecary. I showed her yarrow. I told her the same things my grandmother told me when I was 4 years old. The flat white flower clusters, the fern-like leaves, the chamomile and camphor scent. But I also told her what my grandmother taught me without words, that the watching is the trade, that learning the name of a plant is not the same as learning to see what the plant does, that a village apothecary is not someone who knows facts, but someone who knows how to pay attention. I do not know if Willow will stay. I do not know if she will keep coming back every Saturday. But I know that today for 2 hours she watched, and she wrote down what she saw, and that is how it begins. Marin set down the pen. She looked at what she had written. It was not eloquent. It was not profound, but it was true. It was observation. It was the continuation of the work. She closed the materia medica. She placed it back in the climate-controlled case. She locked the case. She stood in the center of the apothecary for a long moment, looking at the tincture cabinet, at the 108 small drawers, at the display shelf above them with its 28 bottles of amber and green and russet liquid. She thought about what Thomas Fischer had written in his letter. A village apothecary is in the end a person who watches what the plants do and what the weather does and what the bodies of her neighbors do, and who writes down what she sees in a careful book. Marin had been watching for 3 years, and now she was teaching someone else to watch. The trade had not ended in 1968 when Thomas locked the door. It had only waited for someone who would understand that her grandmother had not been teaching her the names of plants at all. Her grandmother had been teaching her the discipline of being the kind of person who notices what plants do. Her grandmother had been giving her the one tool that would make her recognize an apothecary's hidden drawer when she finally stood in front of it. Marin walked to the tall bay window. She put her hand against the glass. Outside, the evening was deepening. The street was quiet. A few leaves were beginning to turn on the maples along Mill Lane. She thought about herself at 24 years old, standing on the same sidewalk for 47 minutes, not knowing why she could not walk away. She thought about the brass key on the faded green ribbon that Iris LeClaire had kept in a drawer for 26 years. She thought about the sound the lock had made when she turned the key for the first time, a small, clean click, as if the key had been used yesterday instead of 56 years ago. She thought about opening the Achillea millefolium drawer and finding dried yarrow flowers that were 55 years old, and smelling the chamomile and camphor scent that rose out of the drawer, and understanding in that moment that her grandmother Bridget had been with her all along. She thought about the hidden compartment, the 3 objects on yellowed cotton cloth, the materia medica, the gold coins, the letter from Thomas Fischer. "Welcome to the apothecary," Marin said quietly to the empty room. "I am home, Mr. Fischer." She turned away from the window. She walked to the tincture cabinet. She opened the bottom right drawer, the Withania somnifera drawer, the one that was artificially shallow to hide the compartment behind it. The drawer was full now. Fresh dried ashwagandha root that Marin had harvested herself and dried in the shade exactly as the Materia Medica instructed. She closed the drawer. She reached behind it and opened the false back panel. The hidden compartment was empty now except for Thomas Fischer's letter. Marin had moved the Materia Medica to the climate-controlled case. She had used the gold coins carefully over 3 years to repair the building and buy materials and support herself while she learned. But she had kept the letter in the compartment because it belonged there, because it was the letter that had welcomed her home. Marin closed the false panel. She stood up. She walked to the front door. She turned off the lights. She locked the door behind her. She climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment. She made a cup of tea. She sat at the small desk by the window. She could see Mill Lane from here, the street lamp coming on as the light faded, the white-clapboard Universalist church across the green, the iron weather vane on its chimney turning slowly in the evening breeze. She opened her own notebook, not the Materia Medica, her personal journal. She wrote, 3 years ago I bought this building for $1. I did not know what I was doing. I only knew I could not walk away. My grandmother Bridget taught me to watch. My mother Colette taught me by example what it means to choose a path and then later to admit you were wrong. Thomas Fischer taught me through a letter written 56 years before I was born that some trades are not about profit or prestige, but about watching and writing down what you see. Today I taught Willa Hartwell to identify yarrow in a field. I showed her the same plant my grandmother showed me when I was 4 years old. And I understood that the circle is not ending. It is only passing from one pair of hands to the next. I am 27 years old. I am a village apothecary. I live above a shop my great-great-grandfather's generation might have recognized. I prepare tinctures using methods that are 140 years old. I harvest plants according to instructions written in Swiss German in 1891. And I am happy. Not because the work is easy. It is not. Not because the work is profitable. It is not that either. But because the work is true. And because when I open the drawer labeled Achillea millefolium and smell the dried yarrow inside, I can hear my grandmother Bridget saying the word yarrow in her kitchen in the Berkshires 33 years ago. And I can hear myself saying the same word to Willa Hartwell this morning in a field behind the apothecary. And I know that the word will keep being spoken by someone, somewhere. As long as there are people who understand that watching is not a waste of time, watching is the work. Marin closed the journal. She drank her tea. Outside, the stars were coming out. The night was clear and cold, the first real cold of the season. Tomorrow she would go down to the apothecary. She would open the drawers one by one. She would check the dried herbs for moisture and mold. She would prepare labels for the new tinctures she had bottled last week. She would write in the Materia Medica. She would continue the work that Johann Fischer had started in 1883. And on Saturday, Willa Hartwell would come back. And they would walk to the river. And Marin would show her comfrey, and she would tell her about harvesting it on the full moon in June, and Willa would write it down in her leather notebook, and the work would go on. Marin stood up. She washed her teacup. She turned off the light. She lay down in bed. She pulled the quilt up. The quilt her grandmother Bridget had made 40 years ago from scraps of fabric left over from sewing projects. Marin had found it in a box after Bridget died. Her mother Colette had given it to her. Marin pulled the quilt close. She thought about the $1 she had spent 3 years ago to buy an empty building in a village she had never heard of. It was the best dollar she had ever spent. Not because the building was worth more than $1, though it was. Not because the gold coins in the hidden drawer had given her the means to survive, though they had. But because the building had given her something she had not known she was looking for. A place to do the work her grandmother had taught her to do. A place to watch. A place to write down what she saw. A place to pass it on. Marin closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the maples on Mill Lane. Inside the apothecary below, 108 small drawers waited in the darkness, each one labeled with a Latin name in faded copperplate script, each one holding the dried leaves or roots or flowers of a plant that had been watched and harvested and prepared with care. And in the climate-controlled case on the opposite wall, the Materia Medica waited. 143 years of careful observation. Written in 3 languages by 4 generations of watchers, the book was not finished. The book would never be finished. Because the work of watching does not end. It only changes hands. From Johann Fischer to Henry Fischer to Thomas Fischer to Marin Gallagher. and someday perhaps to Willa Hartwell, or to someone else who would stand on Mill Lane 50 years from now and look up at the faded sign above the door and feel the small, clean movement of a drawer opening, the beginning of something they could not yet name, but that they would recognize by its shape and its scent and the way it grew. Marin slept and dreamed of yarrow fields and riverbanks and her grandmother's hands showing her how to tie a bundle of dried herbs with cotton string. And in the morning when she woke, the first thing she saw was the light coming through the window, golden and thick with dust, the same light that had been falling through that window for 142 years, falling on the same oak counter and the same tincture cabinet and the same wide pine floor, waiting for the next person to unlock the door and step inside and say in a voice steady and clear, "I am the watcher." Marin Gallagher was 24 years old and broke when she bought an old apothecary for $1 in a village she had never heard of in the northeast kingdom of Vermont. 3 years later, she was 27 and home, and the watching continued.